Welcome everybody to our panel. And please do feel free to move up because it's funny to have people
And it's
all.
cold.
Thank you. Yes, you'll warm us up because it's very cold in here.
Yes, we're freezing.
Okay, so we're here to talk about the issue of gender diversity in the finance space. We're closing the gender growth gap across industries. So we're now 2 years after the beginning of the Me Too movement. I think part of what we're going to discuss on this panel will be what has been positive and maybe not so positive coming out of that social movement. But we're going to speak also specifically about gender diversity in business and how important or not it is to businesses being successful and what each of the panelists here are doing. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have all the way to my right, Jesse Draper, who's the founding partner of Hayle Ventures, which is an early stage venture capital fund focused on female founded consumer technology companies. Next to me is David Jeffrey, who's partner and head of Europe for StepStone Global, which is a global private equity firm. And then to my left here is Megan McDonald, who's global head of investment banking and debt capital markets for Standard Bank Group, which is the largest bank in Africa, based in South Africa. Yep. To her left is Mina Pacheco-Nazemi, who is managing director at Barings, a global investment management firm. And then last but not least is David Warren, founder of DW Partners, which is a $3 billion credit investing firm in New York City. So thank you everyone for being here. Megan, I'm going to go to you first. I think we just want to hear, you've been involved in this or thinking about this issue, I think, for quite a long time, had a long career in finance. So tell us about why is diversity so important to your ability to do business?
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. I think for us at Standard Bank, as Katie said, some of you might not know who we are. We're the biggest bank in Africa. We're present in 20 countries in Africa, and our purpose, which I think is really neat, is Africa is our home. We drive her growth. And that's really interesting because we had a whole debate about, do we drive its growth or do we drive her growth? And it's really great that our CEO has come out very strongly in favor of, and that is our purpose. Africa is our home. We drive her growth. So why do we care about gender equality and gender diversity? I think we've all heard many, many panels at this conference and many, many articles about how most CEOs today are committed to diversity, to gender equality. They all talk about it and they all say it's really, really important. But that commitment isn't really translating into meaningful results, specifically in financial services. I think when you look at the statistics, and you will all know various statistics around this, but women are still significantly underrepresented in particularly senior positions in financial services. I'm now based in London, and a lot of the conversation in London currently is around the gender pay gap. And I was looking up last night as well, here in the US, for every $1 that a man earns, a woman earns 79 cents. And some of that's higher and some of that's lower depending on the industry that you're in. And that's not really about equal pay for equal work. It's actually reflective of the median pay for all jobs held by men and the median pay for all jobs held by women. And so what it tells you when there's a gap is that you have fewer women in senior positions in your organization. And I think particularly in financial services, we see women coming into the workplace in almost equal levels to men, in the sort of junior levels. And then it becomes this pyramid where it gets less and less as women and men progress into more senior roles. So, and the question then is, why should we really care about this? And some people, when I've encountered in London, where we've been talking about the gender pay gap, have said to me, mostly men, this problem will fix itself. So why we're seeing more and more women coming into financial services, why should we care about this? And we've all again got the statistics that if we don't do something about it, it'll take anywhere between 30 and 50 years to get that parity. And again, I was thinking about what reason could we give to girls and young women why they should accept that? So a young woman who's entering the workforce who wants to be the next CEO of Citibank, we can't say to her, wait 30 years and then the environment will be right for you. So that for me is at the heart of this. That is why we should care about it. I think in our organization as well, our CEO is very much committed to this, and he's got a great way of describing it where he talks about achieving gender equality, he says, is a moral duty, a business imperative, and just plain common sense. And so that, I think, encapsulates really why we at Standard Bank think that this conversation is still a very important conversation to be having in 2019.
Yeah. And so thank you for that. And Mina, tell us how Barings thinks about this, how you think about it as a member of the senior team, and particularly the piece around the business imperative as opposed to it being the right thing to do.
Yeah, so I've been investing in the private equity space for the last 15 years and just been a fiduciary for the last 20 years. And I've always taken the approach that you got to look at every opportunity, right? If you're doing your job as a fiduciary, you should look at all opportunities. And what I found, and we've actually done some research around it, is that some of our best investors are actually happen to be women and diverse, right? And based on the 10-year study that we did, we found that 40% of women in diverse funds were first quartile. And let me repeat that, 40%. So that means if you're not looking at women in diverse funds, you're actually missing a big opportunity to generate some alpha for your portfolio. So as we think about investing, there is all those areas and all those studies that speak about the diversity of thought and inclusion that makes a big difference in your management and your decision-making process. And we believe that, but we also believe that it's very important that you have really people, senior allocators, people who can make decisions to invest in women in diverse funds, who in turn invest in women in diverse businesses, who hire women in diverse talent as well. So we think about it from an investment perspective, but we also, like Megan, think about it from a talent perspective for our firm as well.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think it informs the different perspectives? Like, do you think men and women inherently have different perspectives, or ethnically diverse people, talk a little bit about that, how it informs diverse thinking?
Yeah, look, it's like everything. Everybody has to look at all opportunities because at the end of the day, private equity is a very competitive market. Mm-hmm. So if you can look at the same asset and look at it with a different angle and think about creating value because you have another strategic approach than maybe the company had taken, then you're creating value that way. So absolutely, there's an element of how you look at that asset. But going back to the study, what we found is we said, okay, wow, that's pretty impressive that 40% of these women in diverse funds happen to be first quartile. And we actually went back and looked at all of them and said, what were the components for success? And fundamentally, if you think about this business, it's, again, to Megan's point, it's not been historically open to women or as open to women or people of color. So when you find these individuals who've been incredibly successful in their careers, at their platforms, deciding to take a step to start their own firms, it's because they've been rock stars, right? They've had to go through a lot to get to that senior point in their careers. So you have those elements of just, in what we found in our studies, just, different approach, but you have people who've actually been, who've actually had to do more deals, raise more money, create more value for their companies. And that's why they got to those senior positions. And now that's why they're comfortable raising their own funds.
Right. So David Warren, moving down to you, I think of you as probably one of the more enlightened men on Wall Street when it comes to this topic. But you,
low bar. Sorry.
But when we were talking the other day, you said still with all the efforts you make in terms of diverse hiring and being sensitive to this issue, you still have, only one woman trader?
One woman on the investing side.
On the
I mean,
investing
I
side.
think we can stipulate in this room and everything that Megan and Mina said already as to the wherefore, the why. It's just proven that teams that are more diverse do better. It is proven that teams that have men and women, that people of different backgrounds, we don't have to spend a lot of time on that. So the question is not why, it's what do we do about it. And I think it's attracting, retaining, developing, and there's issues with all three. So the easy thing for me to say is, everyone we've hired at DW is somebody who's already had experience, and we don't train people from, we're a fewer than 50-person firm. We don't train people from college. I did a lot of that when I worked at an investment bank, at Morgan Stanley and so forth, so I have a lot of experience doing it, but we don't do a lot of that. So we're looking for experienced people. And so the simple thing for me to say is, we ask for 100 resumes, we get 3 women, 97 men. That's fact. So do we bend over backwards? We think we do. I mean, we probably have biases in the recruiting process that come into play. I tried to get Laura knows, I tried to get a Girls Who Invest intern. I can't get one. There's like a waiting list. So we need more girls. I say girls because before 18, we need more young women. I will go anywhere, anytime, any place to talk about what we do as being awesome for women. I've had 20 women who've worked for me who've had babies and come back and worked. It's a great industry in so many ways, but I don't think the message is out.
Yeah.
So I challenge some of the women on the panel or others in the room to talk about it, but I don't think we're doing a great job of attracting, even though I think the jobs are very attractive.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
In terms of the recruiting, I'm just curious, and I'll move down to the side of the panel too, but for those of you at the bigger companies, do you adopt some of those strategies around recruiting diverse hires? There's a lot of research that shows the language you use on the applications and things like that. Is that something you put stock in, or no?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, you attract, candidates, whether they're coming out of college or, out of banking, typical two-year investment banking. They're going to look to who are the senior people at these organizations, and can they relate to those individuals. So I can draft, a job description that has all the buzzwords, but if they look at an organization and there's not a culture of inclusion, because the culture of inclusion is probably just as critical as just diversity, which typically is about just counting individuals of a certain gender or race. But if you as an organization don't have that culture, it doesn't matter, what you're doing. From a language standpoint on the job description. But I mean, to David's point, I think that, look, absolutely there are less women, and you're absolutely right. When we're recruiting, we have a very similar experience. But what I've found is that there are actually a lot of resources out there besides Girls Who Invest, who I love. I love Janet, and she thinks she's fantastic. There are organizations like SEO who focus on underrepresented minorities, Twigo, through the Robert Twigo Foundation. There's Inroads. And so when managers come to me, private equity managers come to me and they say, well, I can't find the talent. I said, well, have you talked to all of these organizations? Have you sponsored these organizations? Have you tried to do something about it? Have you drawn to recruit at traditionally black colleges? There's so many ways to do it. And two, I mean, I hate to say it, but our business is not rocket science. So at the end of the day, if you find a woman, a person of color who's smart and talented, this is an apprenticeship business. So take the time to train that person, and they are going to be a very loyal, hardworking individual. Mm-hmm. So.
I completely agree. Nope.
I was just going to quickly say, just to add on to that, because I mean, I think a lot of the discussion, particularly within these bigger firms, is widening the funnel and making sure that the funnel is much bigger and you're seeing a much more diverse set of CVs. But fundamentally, the issue is it starts a lot earlier, and this goes way beyond sort of gender. When I'm thinking about recruiting a more diverse talent pool, we had a bunch of 18 to 25-year-olds in our office just last week from some of the most socially disadvantaged areas of London. And it was really to try and demonstrate how what is perceived to be a very inaccessible world, big buildings, finance, the rocket science kind of perception. And actually when they come in and find that there are real people that look like them, right, and actually demonstrating there's a much more accessible world out there, then that's where those seeds are planted. I mean, you know, ultimately it'll end up in a much more broader funnel, but you really need to plant that seed much earlier, such that people can aspire to going to college, getting an education, working hard, actually doing an internship, and then ultimately having a much broader CV set to choose from.
And
Jessie?
women want to see women in these positions like we're all talking about. You know, we seek women as a business. I invest in women. There has to be a female in the founding team of 5, and they come. We saw 5,000 deals last year. I didn't know that was a lot. And then I started talking to Sequoia and all of the traditional VCs on Sand Hill Road, and they're seeing about 1,200 deals a year. And I realized it's because women want a female investor, and I'm like, I wish we had more money to invest, you know? And we're seeing incredible deals from transportation all the way to healthcare. And because we have 50 portfolio companies now, and because we looked off the traditional path, and we, you know, seek out women, and they are seeking us out, we have over 50% minority-led companies as well. And so, you know, I mean, the data is there, as you're saying, you know, diversity breeds success. That's like all shapes and sizes. And, but I think you do have to go off of the traditional path. It's been a huge success for us.
Did you begin Hayle Ventures thinking you wanted it specifically to be women, you wanted to invest in women-founded companies, or did you think of it, this is a market opportunity, I want to go and,
So
you know?
I am a 4th generation investor, and I'm the first female, and I actually thought that I was not able to go into this business that I knew so well, because I grew up around incredible investors, but they were all male, and incredible entrepreneurs, and they were all male. And so I actually started a technology talk show. It was one of the first tech talk shows in 2007. Ran it for about 7 years. We were nominated for an Emmy. I did every distribution deal under the sun in the early days, and I was mainly interviewing men. And so after 2 seasons of that, I said, you know what, I'm going to interview 50% women in technology. And I realized that I could help with this problem in 2 ways. The problem I saw as a little girl, which is like, I wanted to be an investor like my father, who I idolized, but I felt like I didn't see anyone like me. And so I realized I could help by giving women in technology media exposure, and then by helping fund them. So often we'd get pitched by the show, like on the show. So basically after 2 seasons, I said, you know what, we're interviewing 50% women in tech. And they started to come. And at first in 2007, 2008, that was not, you know, it was tough to find women in technology who were willing to put themselves out there. You know, Meg Whitman was not willing to come on like a light and fluffy fun talk show and talk about things other than tech when she was running a tech company. And so I always say I'm forever grateful to Jen Hyman from Rent the Runway and the Gilt Girls, because I believe fashion tech made it okay, because women who had such significant you know, the CEOs back then, they had to fight so hard to get there that they didn't want anything to take it away. And so they weren't willing to put themselves out there or lift women up. So I think I also felt like I couldn't ask them for help, because they were like, no, I can't help. It was so hard to get up here, you know? And so now it's great. We need to continue to give women in technology, well, these are my passions, more media exposure. And then I started writing tiny checks and being a strategic investor in the companies that didn't make sense to be on the show because they were too early. And it kind of happened organically. I had a little beta fund and then raised a fund with that track record. And now we have 50 companies. And we just had $200 million exits in the last 6 months.
Fantastic.
So the data is there. They're, you know, and that's only a couple years in. I'm hoping they're billions soon.
And for the companies you're investing in, it sounds like in recent years you've had sort of an influx of demand of companies that want you to see them.
Yeah, they want, I mean, you know, you guys know all the statistics. 85% of purchasing decisions are made by women in households. And why aren't we also a part of, you know, the companies being built? And so I think, you know, in fashion still, the majority of CEOs are male. I mean, this just doesn't even make sense. And so I think it's important that we change that a little bit. But also it's about equality for me. You know, we have a board, actually, that you might consider working with. I'm on a board of a company called Work. That is an enterprise solution for solving flexibility and retention by, you know, kind of like diversifying your workforce. And we have all females on the board, and I'm like, you know what, we need a qualified male. Like, I think it's not just one way.
Right, right.
But I think what Jesse's bringing up is being intentional. She made the decision to have 50% of the women on her show. And everyone here on this panel has the opportunity to be intentional in who they hire, the investments that they make. And so if you don't you don't actually put the time and effort to do it and actually dedicate time and resources to do it, it won't just happen organically. I mean, unfortunately, we are where we are because of the society and so many different things. So you have to be intentional. And I say that even as an investor. When I talk to our clients, I help them implement diversity inclusion policies so that you're intentional, but you're also institutionalizing the interest, because that CEO may leave, or that CIO may leave as well, or this board member. So we have to focus on making sure it's institutionalized so that that legacy kind of continues on throughout the generations of that organization or that asset management firm or that plan.
I completely agree. And as far as institutionalizing, like I'm making it sound all light and fluffy and happy, but it is really difficult, like as a fund manager, to raise for a female-focused fund. And I realize I'm going like neck and neck with a lot of my founders, which doesn't make sense. And there should be funds that are able to write larger checks. And so what I've realized is it's at the LP level. Like, I walked into a pension fund, and I know there's press in the room. I'm like, they're gonna never invest in my fund, but it'll be fine. But I walked into this pension fund somewhere in the middle of the country, and they literally spat up their coffee at me when they saw my first page of my deck, where I said, look, it's actually a really great business opportunity to invest in women. And they were like, wait, what? Why would you invest in women? And they had called me in, not, I guess, doing their research. And I said, no, like, Dell did a great study. They raised half as much money and double the return. And I mean, that is the level that needs to change, is the LP level.
Yeah.
They need to be more diverse, and they need to, like, these men who many of which are incredible. I just need, we need more women, more diversity at that level, because that's where it all begins.
But it's interesting you say that. I have to say, when I think about where we fit in the food chain, and we sit between a wall of capital on one side, which is effectively that entire LP contingent, and then managers, thousands of managers. We track in our database, I think it's on like 30,000 managers and funds and about 12,500 managers. So a huge kind of array. And one of the reasons why we're so passionate about this issue is it's actually client driven. The LP community across the board, admittedly differently from a geographic perspective, but in aggregate, I would say that this is a very important issue for all the reasons we've talked about. But fundamentally, when you really break it down, it's important to retain talent, as we've talked about. It's important because they recognize innovative and creative thinking. But one of the things hasn't been mentioned, but it's very important for LPs, is it actually reflects strong management, good management at the GP level. And I think, just anecdotally, to give you an example of that, a company that's actually looking to invest in an underlying portfolio company that's looking to go public, in the public markets, they do a very good job of exposing, from a sort of transparency issue, all these issues, gender, diversity. And if you are not up to scratch in terms of your credentials, then you're going to get discounted at the market. And the LP community as a whole, there are definite exceptions, but as a whole, they recognize that. And that's why this has become such a such a strong force for good.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was just going to say, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that the demand from the LP side is real. And as kind of a practitioner, someone who believes in it and is it, I think the most frustrating thing about just hearing all the talk is just the limited action around it. And people use it as a marketing tool. They use it as a way to let their clients know that they care. But at the end of the day, when you look at where they've invested in, where they've put their money, it's not a reflection of what they say their mission and their values are. So I spend a lot of time thinking about that in terms of how our organization also works. Like, we've backed a lot of women and diverse managers. Like, actually 100% of our first-time funds were women and diverse last year. And so we do practice with what we preach, and it's because we do believe in the opportunity, but I don't think that the market is actually there despite all of the talk and despite the interest from the LP space.
So that's my question to kind of go to the next level here, because I think, I mean, even in the years that we've been hosting the global conference and hosting diversity sessions, I don't know how many of you are regular attendees. How many is this the first conference, first time you've been here? Oh, wow, so quite a few.
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. So I've been at the Institute 12 years. The first time we hosted a diversity session was probably 8 or 9 years ago. I'm looking at my old boss in the room who remembers we were passionate, meaning previous boss.
Prior boss.
Not old. And you remember us kind of talking about this, but the first time, I think it was probably 8 or 9 years ago, we had a session that was at 6:30 in the morning, and we had maybe 8 or 9 women in the room, and that was it.
We had like 10% of the speakers were women.
Right. So fast forward, and we have probably 15 to 20 different sessions that are usually pretty well attended. So there's no question where it's moving, the momentum is moving in that direction. And I often find myself moderating sessions where everybody's happy to agree that the data say one thing, it's all positive. There's no question it impacts returns in a positive way, impacts management, and the companies perform better. So then why are we where we are, I guess is my question. I think, you know, I'm not saying it's an easy question to answer, there's complexities to it, but when we were in the speaker ready room preparing to come into the session, I was sharing a study from Lean In, Sheryl Sandberg's organization, which published a study after the Me Too movement, finding that over 50% of men are actually now afraid to take a woman to dinner on their team. And I mentioned this, David, I hope you don't mind me calling you out, but I mentioned this to him over the weekend, and he said, oh, isn't that interesting? And then just this morning when I saw him, he said, oh, you wouldn't believe 5 or 6 different men said this to me. So
This weekend,
Yeah,
in this conference.
I totally get it, but can I just put that on blast completely? Because I think, sorry, on blast, it's just like a slang term if you're familiar. But why are we still having dinners? Like, I have 2 kids. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I'm so sick of these dinners. Have a brunch, have a lunch. I will drink a glass of wine at 4 p.m.
The statement is, I will not be alone ever.
With a girl, yeah.
Doesn't matter with a woman, doesn't matter if it's at a ball game, lunch, brunch, drinks, they won't do it.
But like I learned when I was like 25, you know, I would come to all these incredible conferences and I was like, okay, I peace out at 7 p.m. because men do get a little sloppy with the second glass of wine. I mean, women do too, but I was just like, okay, this is a business setting, I'm out.
But at the same time, I think you could say that a lot of the informal relationships that you need to form for your career to be successful happen either after hours or outside of formal meeting settings, right? So I would view that as an important time for women to gain access to different senior people. And if the reality is that half of men feel intimidated by this, that's a problem for women.
It's true. Yeah,
So
I get
this
that.
is a problem that I think is, what really concerns me around this is that we're becoming a bit polarized. So we're going back to extremes because men are feeling threatened, hence they feel that they might be accused of something, so they won't go out for the dinners. Just have a look around this room, and the vast majority of people in this room attending these sessions are women.
Oh, exactly.
Right.
And you've been to many of these sessions where, again, the vast majority are women. So this, for me, is at the heart of the problem as to why we're not making real progress, as we've all spoken about. Men have to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, I did hear the masculinity panel in this room was packed.
It was full,
Well,
yeah.
Megan,
continue.
I was just going to say that's an absolutely key point. I mean, we actually have a group in the UK which is called Men Advocating Real Change, and it's absolutely critical that what happens, and I speak on many of these panels, particularly in Europe, where, as you say, they are actually packed, but they tend to be packed by women, and the problem is, and I often be, one of the only male panelists, and even, I guess, today it's not a particularly...
Thank you.
Even today, it's not a particularly diverse male panel because both of us are white middle-aged. We both call David, and we both have a similar haircut. So,
Right. And sorry, you have to tell to both be named David. I think the stat is like, or maybe it's John. There are more CEOs named John, named David than there are women CEOs. So we are fully represented by Davids. Thank you.
So with that, but I would, on a serious point, I would actually, the broader question that you raised, Katie, is an important one because, as I think you were referring to, and we actually call this as part of being responsible investors, and we actually had a panel at our own investor conference as it relates to ESG investing, responsible investing, and we entitled it "Painting the Greenwashers into a Corner." And it's exactly that. It's effectively recognizing that there's a spectrum of difference across the world of private equity, venture capital, private market as a whole, actually, whereby there are some people that frankly couldn't care less and are honest enough about it, by the way, that they couldn't care less. There are some people, a small number, who not only walk the talk, but walk the walk but talk the talk. But the vast majority have very clever placement agents, very clever marketing decks, and are told you have to have a slide on diversity, you have to have a slide on responsible investing on ESG. And I think certainly our role, as I said, within the food chain, is to ensure that more of that is actually real rather than just hot air and guff. And I think, without being overly, optimistic about it, I do think the trend is upwards and to the right. I do think that every year that goes by, I do think that these rooms tend to fill up over time. As I mentioned to Katie, I was in a conference just last year in Europe, and I made the comment, you know what, this shouldn't be a side stream. In a couple of years, this should be in the mainstream, and in a couple of years after that, we shouldn't be talking about this. This should just be part of the general discussion. And to my huge surprise, last year that was actually mainstream. So with a bit of hope, we won't be talking about it at all. But that's kind of I think that is the direction of travel. I am an optimist about this, but I do think that is the direction of travel that we're seeing more and more.
I agree.
Yeah. Maybe a question to you who are the investors on the panel. So when you look at companies and they tell you about their diversity and their plans, and how many women are in the room talking about that? And do you insist? I mean, you should not go to the meeting, or you should leave the meeting if people are talking about diversity, but it's all white men who are talking to you about that. And we kind of have this experience coming from South Africa, obviously with the history of the racial issues that we face in South Africa. It's something that's been an issue for us in terms of transformation of people of color in our business. And a number of our clients, when we go and see them, if we don't have people of color in our delegation, they refuse to see us.
Yeah. I think you bring up a good question. So like what we do is we actually have a diversity survey that before we make any commitment to any manager, we actually have them fill it out. But because that's like a very simple thing we do. But a big part of what we do is you spend a lot of time, it's private equity, you spend a lot of time with the people, understand the culture, even understand things like how do people get promoted? How do you get on the investment committee? How do you become a partner? Right. And so looking and understanding that is really critical to understand. They can be all white guys, but if they have a culture of inclusion, maybe they are promoting young women within the organization, that's the type of thing that we're looking for. There's been a lot of just interesting press on certain managers. One manager that there was a woman that got kicked out, and there were prominent investors in that fund. And when I've asked some of those investors, you've backed that manager before, how did you miss this type of activity, this type of character amongst the partnership? How did you miss that?
What'd they say?
And they said, well, it wasn't really, what could they say? They didn't have a real answer. And the reality is, it is our job as asset allocators, folks like ourselves and obviously David at StepStone, to spend the time to understand who we're backing, right? Because at the end of the day, you're giving money to someone for 10 to 12 years, right? It can even be 15 years in some situations. So that understanding who you're backing and the character is really, really critical. And so we do the diversity study, we spend a lot of time with our managers before we give them capital. We actually track performance on an annual basis. We see any changes there. We even get into the level of our women, people of color, at the same level as being compensated in the same way. We look at carry structures. So those are all things that we're doing, but I also know we're not in the majority of doing that. So we need to do more.
And how far do you think you go, and this is sort of a question for the panel, but how far do you go in mandating some of these diversity policies? Would you not invest in a company if it didn't have X number of women on the board, or?
No, it's to me, like anything around ESG is a risk mitigator. I'm mitigating risk. So I would not invest in that company or that management team if I felt that they weren't being inclusionary, right? So it's about, again, the character. So again, we're mitigating risk as an investor, and especially when you're talking about people, a people business, it's really critical to have people who are open-minded, who can solve problems in the tough times. Mm-hmm.
But people like Mina and me and David, we are in this position, privileged position, but also a very responsible position, because we have the good fortune of seeing many, many managers and many different ways of running businesses. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way, but I think that our role in many ways is to share what we feel is best practices. Mm-hmm. Because candidly, we can find very undiverse managers who are extremely strong performers, like, for example, an all-women team, mm-hmm. right? And we're not basically coming along and saying you shouldn't have an all-women team, you should be much more diverse. There are groups that perform extremely well, but the reality is that group doesn't necessarily have the visibility on thousands of other managers who've done things differently and might be able to make incremental improvements. Mm-hmm. And again, that's why I'm saying I don't think it's necessarily a passionate right and wrong way, black and white binary decision of managing these kind of businesses. But I do think that being able to educate and to a certain extent evangelize as to the benefits of diversity is kind of part and parcel of the dialogue.
So how do you hold them accountable?
I think that's in part, just as you said, it is in part of the due diligence.
But post-investment?
Post-investment, how do you hold them accountable after the investment?
Yeah, so, they took your best practices, great. So how do you hold them accountable?
I think it's a very good question. I think within the world of private markets compared to public markets, because it's locked up capital for a long period of time, you can do what you can do if you're on the advisory board. You can do less than that if you're effectively a shareholder that you turn up once a year. But ultimately, you have the power of capital in terms of being able to provide follow-on capital as to whether or not that business survives or not, which I know is not immediate, but I mean, in the world of private markets, that's ultimately the power of the purse.
Yeah. I think we're touching on kind of the whole question of targets, because we're a publicly listed company, and for me, because David Warren was making the point, we all know that we should do this, but actually the progress hasn't really been where we want it to be. And I think for me, one of the key things, it's got to come from the top, and you've got to set targets. And I know there's a sensitive debate around targets versus quotas, but we're all in business. All the stuff that's important to us in business, we set targets. We track, we report, we measure progress. Why don't we do that enough for gender and diversity targets? So we've been challenging our CEO, and just late last year, he's actually come out with some targets. We've got 55,000 employees, 20 countries in Africa, and he's committed we will have our board representation from 22 to 33% by 2021. Another interesting thing is we've got chief executives in our country. So we operate in Nigeria, in Kenya, and so on. And this is a lot of women of color, where obviously we're talking about challenges for mostly white women. Yep. These challenges are way more acute for women of color, and we've committed to growing our female chief executives, and mostly that's women of color, from 10 to 20%. I think you've got to come out publicly. You've got to give these targets. We measure turnover. We measure return on equity. You measure kind of growth in sales, and you report on it to the market. Why not this? Mm-hmm. If it's important, and there's that saying, that which gets measured gets done. Mm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so what about within companies, policies that help support some of this? So like, Jesse, I know you were being a little facetious saying, I don't want to go to any more dinners.
Yes.
But there is something to say, which I think the gender divide is different in this way, in the sense that women birth and often care for children. That gets to be a touchy subject when you bring that up, of how that impacts or doesn't their contribution in the workforce. But there are companies that embrace policies, and more so in Europe, actually, with progressive. Well, and this is an interesting point, is that you think of many European countries and companies within Europe as having very progressive maternity leave policies, and they may have more women working, but fewer in senior positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you touch upon actually is a very important point in terms of both cultural and geographic differences. And so, yes, I'm based in Europe. We have our own organizations. One of them was in the private equity world it's called Level 20, which effectively trying to get 5 to 6% exposure of women in senior positions to 20%, which sounds very modest and should be much higher, as you were talking about, but it's incremental. It's a similar case to the 30% club, which is in the world of public markets. But I would tell you that within Europe, there's a vast difference between the various regions. And so, what I think, we were talking about minority and women-owned firms. Well, actually, we have many minorities and many women working in businesses, but very few are denoted as such. And so I think that it's just interesting when we think about it across the world. It may surprise you, but actually within the world of private equity and venture capital, China is actually very high at the list, if not at the top of the list, compared to the US and some of the European countries. In Southern Europe, dramatically lower than the rest of Europe and many of the US benchmarks. So I do think the broader point you're touching upon, Katie, is culturally and geographically, this is a much more nuanced and difficult problem to address as opposed to just a sort of a one-size-fits-all here in the US.
I mean, I hate to say it. I'm a mother, and I'll tell you, I became way more efficient and more productive as a mother, right? Those hours I was in the office, I produce a lot more than I think some of my male colleagues. So I really hate it when people talk about women and when they become, they have.
And also men face the same struggles.
Sure. I mean, we had an opinion that there is a clearly underutilized group of people in this country, which are women who have taken time off from work and then want to come back and really struggle to re-enter. We hired a firm. There's a firm called Prokenga. We don't own any part of Prokenga. We just use them. And we hired a woman. She had, how many years had she been off work?
2.5.
2.5. She came back. She wanted to work like 9 to 2. I think she's the hardest working person in the company.
So efficient.
And we'll call her she'll call us at 5 o'clock. We said, you're supposed to be off. She said, no, my kids are here and there. And
Stop telling me that. I'm doing that.
I don't know if you can hear Laura saying, yeah, but we need to do more of this.
Yeah.
We need to do more of this.
You made the point about retention, and I think that's a huge thing.
Right.
And why I started a women's group, and we identified getting women in, lots of people doing that, getting women in C-boards.
Laura, take the mic.
Sorry, people focused on that. I think there's this in between, like when you're in your 30s, and it just sucks. If you're a male, you're a female, you're managing up, you're managing down, you're not getting paid. If you kind of have the option, I think it's too easy. And the awesome Women Our Team has started a support group of not me, but other young women who just had a child at other firms that they meet for lunch once a quarter and talk about it. And that's when you got to keep people and all you've invested for selfishly as well as for reputationally and keeping women. You just need to keep people retained in that delicate area in between.
I mean, I think a lot of women, I think definitely some women want to take some time off to not, to spend time at home. But I think a lot of women leave because how we started the conversation on the pay gap. Because I'm getting paid 30 to 40 cents less than my male colleague. Why am I here? It's the pay gap and then, the glass ceiling that people talk about all the time. So if you're not getting paid and you're not getting promoted, then that's when you see more women leave. Yes, some women want to leave because they want to stay at home, but most women I know have gone to business school, hard charging, intelligent, driven. If they leave the workforce, it's more because of that than because they necessarily want to spend,
Well, I think it's all that they just want flexibility. They just can't do a banking job with those hours. It's like they just can't.
It's the
they
clock
literally
in,
cannot
clock out.
do that job and stay successful. And so finding ways to give them flexibility. I mean, actually, like to your earlier point, just the reason why the gap is there is because there's not more senior women. So I think there's not more senior women because they're dropping out for various reasons.
But it's interesting, Laura,
provide.
you mentioned in terms of retention, it's not just retention, but it's recruitment. And again, going back to some of the nuances, it's fascinating. We recently incorporated a whole new maternity and paternity policy, which we were really proud of because we actually scoured the world, particularly in the US, and we thought we'd found what we thought was the absolute best and actually was well known within the US, particularly in the buyout community, of actually attracting people, not just retaining people. We rolled it out in Europe, and I was particularly targeting a very senior female candidate who was working within this firm. And to my surprise, she said, actually, I don't find that attractive at all. That actually encouraged me. Your whole policy encourages me back into the workplace quicker than I would have ever done. So as I'm competing effectively and I can keep up with my male colleagues. And so again, the kind of the messaging and the nuance of that was something that it was very enlightening in many ways to make sure that it's not just message, but it was also it's culturally sensitive.
So one of the points you made, Laura, is that you're saying these women can't do banking jobs. That really concerns me, coming from the banking world. And I agree with your comment. It's really tough for women. And it's up to us to create, one of the biggest challenges is to create those flexible working hours. And we've got to change our mindset in terms of how we regard our employees. So the old investment banking mindset where I come from, if you're not in the office at 7 or 8 p.m., you're not doing a great job. We all know of fantastic women who might leave at 5, go home and do the homework, put your children to bed, back online at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., doing great work. We have to change our mindset because women can do these jobs, but will do them differently. And I think that's where having more senior women in decision making will create some of that framework. I'll never forget when the first lady in my team fell pregnant, my boss came to me as a white male, and he was beside himself. And I said to him, this is not a terminal illness. She's going to come back.
Contrary to popular belief.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. And she did come back, and she turned out to be, one of our superstars. But we really have to look at this.
So I'm going to...
It's like no more clock in, clock out mentality. I think that's bad, and that creates a horrible culture in general.
Right, that's what. But I'm not in banking. Our perception of banking is, I know because I talk to analysts who work for these investment banks, and they're sitting there waiting for work, and that's not on the investing side. That's not what we do.
Well,
I'll run an experiment in this room because I'm about to go on a long flight. How many people love going on a long flight because you're quiet, it's quiet, you're not interrupted, et cetera? So then the same thing when a woman goes home or a man goes home from work, deals with their children, their spouse, et cetera, and then goes online at night, it's like the same as being on a plane. It's quiet, it's uninterrupted, they do their best work. So, I mean, my takeaway from this, I'm trying to listen here too. So from Mina, I'm getting try harder. So I get that, we'll try harder. I've strongly encouraged the women's groups to stop being women's only groups. So it sounds like David's getting included. I'm not invited to anything, so except for this, I'm not invited to anything. And so we need to be part of the dialogue. I'm scared that it is going to be 30, 40 years with men not being included in this process, and it's not going to be 3 to 5 years. So I love your optimism, David, but I don't. When I talk to men, and you guys aren't in the room, it is a different conversation. And we have to fix that. We have to change it.
So
we need help.
Ask you a question?
So like you can ask me a question, but like Mina's telling me, rattling off 7 groups. I've never heard of any. I heard the first one. The next 6 I never heard of. So I'll get on any email group.
Don't worry, I'll connect you.
But men, my question is, and I know there's other questions in the audience. We're not even technically doing Q&A yet, but we'll start, I think, because a lot of people have stuff to say. But David, do you think that men don't speak about that in mixed company because they're afraid of getting attacked or for sounding stupid?
No. No, they have their strong views. They tell them me privately, and they're not
why
ready
not
to change.
But why not say them to women? Just
because they'll know they'll be excoriated.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, I think that's part of the problem.
I have a good little story on that.
Go for it.
It won't take long, but it was actually talking about getting excoriated, but actually men speaking their mind. I was actually at a conference in Europe, and it was exactly this kind of discussion topic. The place was packed, and just like I said, it was all women, and the panel was all women apart from me. But there was one guy in the front row who actually I knew from, I'm not going to say which country, but let's just say Southern Europe. And we started off the panel, and the moderator said, the opening line was, we only have 6% of senior women within the world of private equity. And before she'd even started or introduced the panel, this guy had his hand up, question. So I said, we're going to have to stop and ask the guy a question. He said, look, I know what you're going to say, but 6%, I'm from Southern Europe, never going to get to 6%. And you could hear everyone sort of, breathe in. And so he said, and there's 2 good reasons. Right? And you're thinking, what's he going to say? Believe it or not, he said the following 2 reasons. The first thing he said is, well, in my country, the way we negotiate, it's very passionate, it's very aggressive, and it really needs a man to be on the other side of the argument.
Oh my God.
And by the way, you have to remember the whole of the, this was a packed room, and you could hear, I thought there was a riot that was going to break out. I said, come on, let's hear the second one as if it could be any worse. And it was. And he
What was
said,
the second one?
my country, and you can probably guess which country it is, it's a very family-orientated country. And therefore, it's very important for the mother to be at home and the father to be doing these negotiations. At which point, I got to tell you, a riot didn't break out, but there was a discussion from the floor for the rest of the entire panel. And it was such a robust and lively discussion that I almost thought, with hindsight, that guy could have been a paid actor just to liven the whole thing up.
Right.
So, that's my story. But it talks of, in terms of excoriation, but actually speaking their mind, it was interesting, right? Because that was, if he wasn't a paid actor, that clearly was what he was, and he didn't care what people thought. But that was what it was, and his business was run accordingly.
Right.
So what do you like when you've been in those private conversations? What is your response?
I tell them they're ridiculous. They tell me, you have to have confidence. It's funny, we take risk for a living. That's what we do. So if I'm going to take Laura out for a drink and she's going to accuse me of something I didn't do, I'm willing to take that risk because it's important that she gets that same mentorship that a guy would get. And I'm just going to do it. And do I tell the men that? I said, yes, of course.
Just take them to lunch.
Whatever. Breakfast. You got to know your audience. You got to know your audience. But I do think we haven't spent much time on this panel, and I doubt we'll have much time to go through. But I do think mentorship is huge. I was mentored. I had people that I wanted to be like. They were all men. And so we need more women mentors, but I think I can still mentor women. It's just, it's very hard because just because I've read the Danny Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I know I have biases, I know I have them, doesn't mean that just because I know that I won't express those biases. We all like to have people around us who seem like us. You just have to take yourself out of that a bit.
But the mentorship, I think Amina touched upon it, the mentorship coupled with that role models, we found incredibly important. The more senior women we've had in our own firm or in other firms that we invest in, those are really the people that, for example, women really focus on and say, well, if she's got to that position and she actually mentors me or sponsors me or has some sort of much closer dialogue to help my own career, that's what we've found has a disproportionate effect to really help both those underlying companies that we've invested in.
But to be clear, I think if a white male sponsors a woman, that's way more powerful.
Mm-hmm. It's the point I was going to make as well.
It's way more powerful.
Yeah.
So you taking the time to do that versus one of your female, look, they're both great and even, and it's great, either of you, to mentor a woman, but I think it's way more powerful. So the fact that you're on this panel, I appreciate.
Me
So
too.
you're, so we got to recognize that. But I think it's more important for more white males to.
So at the risk of getting into semantics, we actually distinguish between mentorship and sponsorship. And actually the sponsors tend to be the prevalent. If it's white males, that's so be it. Frankly, if it's an all-women group, then maybe it's a different sponsor. But I'm just saying the sponsor tends to play a different role than the mentor. And we think it's very important that the sponsor's role is to really help that career path, particularly in a, for example, male-dominated company. So the two different roles from a sponsor and a mentor.
Yeah.
Okay, we are going to go out to the audience actually because we're getting close to the end, or we have 6-7 minutes left. Mindy, did you have a quick? Why don't you tell us who you are and where you're from?
I'm Mindy Silverstein, and I am a very proud Milken alum, and I work at Credit Suisse. I live in Switzerland. I moved from LA. So this is super interesting, a wonderfully moderated panel, and great panelists. I mean, there's so many things that I want to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what
I mean, the first thing I mean, I
You're
have
meant
so
for a sponsor to
yeah, exactly. A sponsor, you put them in the job, you help them,
And then you move to Zurich.
and then you move to Zurich. But I think, so one, on just this last comment, I think it's senior people. My boss is a black male, and he picked me and was like, you have to come and do this job and work for me. So I have people I work with all around the world who are senior people who are like, we should do this together, or we should do this. And so I also think calling it mentoring and sponsoring and all these things, that's just what guys are doing for each other all the time. That's what you're
All
doing
the
for
time.
any of
Yeah,
your
all the
friends.
time.
Exactly.
That's what you're doing
But it's
for
not
anyone
formalized,
you respect and that you, so that's one. Two, about the comment about the MBAs and things like that. So Katie and I, very long ago, worked at United Way together. And
Recovering do-gooders.
recovering do-gooders at United Way, and I can tell you all of our colleagues were two income if they had two parents in the family, because that's what they had to do. And then from my MBA class, like 5 of my friends work out of like 100. And it's because, and I read there's an article that was in Harvard about how you're much more likely to drop out if you go to an Ivy, drop out if you go to Ivy League. Why? Because you can afford it. You can still live in...
New York Times article this past weekend.
Yes.
Really good article, yeah.
So you can still live, and you're going to live in Westport or whatever, and you can afford it if you marry someone who went to an Ivy. So
Well, and interestingly, what the New York Times article... Thank you, Mindy, for that. Did you have a question, or were you...
Well, I did, in terms of... Because I think there is... No, actually, I just wanted to talk. No. I don't know. I'm really jet lagged.
Okay, let me finish the thought, and then we can come. Because the New York Times article David's talking about was interesting, because what it said was actually that it was counterintuitive. It was that the top, because the wage gap is actually most pronounced at the most senior levels and the wealthiest people. And part of that is not because women by and large are dropping out of the workforce because their husbands are so wealthy. Their husbands are so wealthy because the women are dropping out of the workforce. So because we're now in an economy that rewards overwork. So if you work 50% more, you're not making 50% more, you're making 100% more. And that to the point of the gender disparity in work, whether you have an understanding boss who says you can do the research from home and get online when you get back home, not everybody is that way. So
So I totally, in my jet lag state, forgot to say like the 2 punchlines. Number one is when I talk to my friends who have the MBAs, they're always like, especially when I was at Milken, and I always loved being here and loved my work. I'd be like, why? Well, why? Of course you're there because you love it. Because you there's a reason to be there. Like if I'm out like marketing toilet paper, of course I'm gonna stay home with my family, and that's way more fulfilling. So that's one thing. And the other thing I was just going to say is like, it's all balance. And I get really tired of it being like, oh, working mom. I'm like, every family needs balance, and to be thinking about that. And how do you juggle as a family unit or whatever you are in whatever convention that is. And the other thing is we could have a whole long conversation about Europe is a totally different mindset. And Switzerland is basically the Ivy situation on steroids, you know what I mean? So we have 25% women on our executive board. We're very proud of it. But you just have to do it. It's like you just need people who make those decisions. So.
It's actually interesting. I'm a member of PE-WIN, actually founded by Kelly Williams, one of the smartest people I know in the business, and the founder of the Customized Fund Group. And in one of the sessions I was at, I ended up realizing they asked the question, how many of the members were actually the breadwinners? And it was the overwhelming majority of the PE women where the females were the breadwinners in their. So I thought it was a really interesting, I didn't have an appreciation for that.
Yeah.
But I thought that was really interesting. So they, for a lot of those women, they needed to continue on. They needed to kind of go out there and do another fundraising meeting, right? Or go meet another management team because they were the primary breadwinner. So,
do we have other questions? Yeah. Can you say your name and where you're from?
Sure. Tracy, Brisco, Monroe. I'm with UBS. So I think one of the most interesting things here is what's missing is a discussion of networks. So I think part of the reason you have not heard of Twigo or SEO is because if you looked at your LinkedIn profile and all of your connections, you probably don't have much diversity there. I'm guessing. Am I right?
Probably, yes. I'll say yes.
No, I'm not challenging.
No, yes.
That is. But part of the problem is people often don't reach out to people of color. If you're walking around the halls here, how many people have actually stopped to talk to someone to see who they were that looked differently from them? Men looking at women, women looking at other people of color. Mina and I know each other. I knew she was going to be on the panel today. I said, I'm coming to support you. I want to hear what you have to say. And I think that you'll be surprised. If someone asked me, I need an African-American female PE manager. I could give you 10 who have a great track record. We all know each other. You guys need to get to know us, because we have to really support one another. So if there's someone in need, someone who needs to leave a position, we rally around those people. Women do it. Men have always done it. But people of color have to do it in a very intense way. And we have to be very secretive about it, because oftentimes we don't want to leave our positions or be asked to leave our positions before we're ready. We want to make those decisions on our own. And so we're very careful about who we confide in, who we talk to, and we're very deliberate about the kinds of people we seek out to meet. So I think the network is really, really key, and we haven't talked about that all today. Most of my jobs I've been able to obtain through people I knew, former bosses, people who mentored me, and I have mentors who have been with me, mostly white males, and they've been terrific. But they've looked out for me. They've called and said, this position is coming up. I think you'd be fantastic. I already put in your name. That's what we need to do. We need to be intentional. We need to broaden our networks. And we need to recognize that people come from all backgrounds. And just because they do doesn't mean we don't have things in common. So.
Right. So that's the end of our session. We didn't end on a question, unfortunately, but we do have to stick to the schedule. I want to thank everyone, the two Davids and everyone else, for participating in the session. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll see you next time.